So thank you, Melissa. Thanks for all your hard work organizing this week. And it's a delight that we can offer this online. And, this week, as you saw from the schedule, we have some days where we're dealing with leadership and coaching. Other days we're dealing with real content on journalism trends with Lynn Walsh later in the week. But we also, as you know, care a lot about religion as a topic in society, in public life, as a topic that some of our friends and brethren in the journalism world maybe don't know enough about. And so that's what the Media Project does that's unique and different, is focus on religion and not be scared of covering religion, but go into the zone and cover it. And as we know, to cover religion well, we need to understand religion. And so today we have our board member, Dr. Paul Marshall, of the Media Project. Many of you know him. He's been involved with the Media Project for a long time. And he's going to talk to us about understanding Christian-Muslim conflict. And just a few points about his bio and background. He's studied this topic in the UK in his PhD. He's written about 20 books or so. He's written extensively and appeared on many broadcast outlets all around the world. And he continues working in this topic both as a senior fellow at the Lamena Institute in Indonesia and affiliated with other institutions there, and also his affiliation with the Hudson Institute in Washington, D.C. on topics of religious freedom, and at Baylor University at the Institute for Studies of Religion, where he's a research professor in the Department of Political Science. So he brings all this experience and knowledge to us today, and we're very grateful to have you with us, Dr. Marshall.
Okay, thank you very much, Paul. And thanks to all of you who have tuned in. Let me just first mention at the outset, you can't see it when I'm looking in, but if I turn my head sideways, my head had an encounter with a brick wall a couple of days ago, and I'm still feeling a little under the weather because of that. But I think we'll all manage very well. Some background picking up on what Paul number one, had said. What I want to do, one of the things I find is that particularly in the non-Muslim majority world, many people know very little about the history of Islam or the history of the Muslim world. They're not necessarily the same thing. Within the Muslim majority world, people may know more, but often I feel it's inaccurate. So, but unless we understand something of this history, I don't think we'll be able to understand modern tensions, conflicts, and misunderstandings. So here I want to concentrate on history, also geography. I'll be using quite a few maps. So that's the background of what I want to do. Now let me hold up let me show the screen here. I can do this. Okay, can you all see that title?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, it's working. I've never done this before. I'm a technological idiot, so I'm always nervous about what's happening. So I'll start off with a rhetorical question. If you've been following the news from Afghanistan in the last couple of months, you'll see, apart from the Taliban takeover, there's been discussion about ISIS, the Islamic State, and they've carried out a few attacks. And it's usually referred to as ISIS-K. And my question, and I don't expect you to answer, but I've asked a few people who said, do you know what the K stands for? But very few people do. It actually stands for Khorasan. the Islamic State in Khorasan. And the question is, what's Khorasan? Going further back with ISIS in Iraq, when its leader was al-Baghdadi, he also kept referring to Khorasan and Sham and so forth. And these are sort of ancient Muslim countries or regions, and they're still very much alive in the understanding of people in ISIS, and indeed probably people also in the Taliban. Or you get other things with Al-Qaeda, often refers to Andalusia, which is southern Spain. And as you probably know, the majority of Spain was run by Muslims for a period of 700 or 800 years. So you will find in statements here, I'm quoting terrorist organizations, but this applies to many non-terrorist and very peaceful Muslims as well. A lot of references to history, which has shaped the way they see the current world, and for which I don't want to project on you and say what you don't know, but I find a lot of us don't know these things. So I want to summarize this history. So in the next 20 minutes, I'm going to summarize about 1,400 years of world history, I hope. Okay. One of the things, an important thing to understand about Islam is for most of its history, it has been remarkably successful. Let me just go here. You see that map in front of you. In Muslim tradition, Muhammad, at his death in 632, Muslims controlled this dark purple area, 632, and then increased expansion. So you go to the next level of expansion, and this is where we are in 661. This is 29 years later. Okay, here we're looking at Persia, even beyond Persia, getting into Pakistan, all the way to the Atlantic. Okay, that's in 29 years, less than 3 decades. If you push it up to 750, then we can start including the lightest purple areas here. Now take over Spain into France. I'll get back to that. On this side, moving into what is now India, and actually on the Talas River here, into what is now China. The one thing I alluded to, this is 750. If you took it back to 732, the expansion would go to here, Poitiers in France. In 732, Arab armies were 100 miles south of Paris. So you have, oops, go back. So here you have the creation, a rulership stretching from the Atlantic Ocean, from Paris to the borders of China and into India. This is remarkable expansion. And before we get too critical of Muslims and saying, well, this is imperialism, it is. But if the Byzantine Empire centered in Constantinople could have done that, I mean, it would. We're dealing with an age of empires, and people expanded as far as they could. I don't like empires particularly, but this expansion, the fact they wanted to expand was not new. What was quite remarkable was the success in, from China to the Atlantic. in a space of 100 years. So success militarily, also success. Muhammad himself was successful as a political leader, as a military leader, and as a religious leader. And most Muslims expected success, and that's what they got. They got it here. So you not only had this particular expansion in the earlier one, but let's take another map. This is by the year 1100. I hope you can see this green line here. This is now the area of expansion of Muslim control. It doesn't mean that most of the people in the area were Muslims. They weren't, but these were areas ruled by Muslims. In Spain, ongoing conflict, which went on to 1492, but a pushback here against Muslims in Spain. But now one sees expansion across the Sahara into West Africa, and almost now reaching into the areas of Nigeria. Then major expansion down the east coast of Africa into Madagascar, moving further into India, and then began to take over what is now Turkey, the Byzantine Empire. Okay, so here we're looking after 500 years. Moving ahead to the year 1500, so driven out of Spain at this point. So, but further expansion into West Africa, down the coast of Africa here to Zimbabwe, to Madagascar. Then expansion taking over now most of India, then moving into what is now Malaysia, then Indonesia, and the southern Philippines. So, whereas on this side, further expansion to Central Asia, and then now into what is now Russia, and then a beginning takeover of the Balkans, southeastern Europe. So up to 1500, with except for the slight pushback from Spain, in Spain, a continual expansion. And attacks on other places, if you don't know about this, the burning of churches in Rome in 846. In fact, Arab armies getting into Switzerland. So the expansion in the West eventually included the countries we now call Greece, Italy, Bulgaria, Romania, Hungary, Serbia, Bosnia, Austria, the Ukraine, and Moscow. Indeed, there were slave raids as far as Iceland. So again, I'm giving you this picture of expansion, mainly by conquest in the West. And if you, for the East, this last part, certainly from 1100 onwards, you had this map, there was a military expansion into India, but the further expansion into much of India and then Southeast Asia and parts of Africa was much more peaceful through traders and missionaries. So in this sense, at this point, the Muslim world would be the dominant world civilization. This is 500 years ago, true even 400 years ago, maybe 300 years ago. It occupied the center of the world. At this point, the Americas don't really come into the picture. And it had no real rivals, except possibly China, but at this point, China was content to stay within its border. It was the, it stretches from Moscow down to Mozambique. through the Atlantic, through to the Philippines. And in contrast, the Christian world, most of the Christian world has now been taken over by Muslims. The areas where Christians still ruled at this point up here was, for most of the parallel history, very poor and barbaric. It certainly didn't measure up to the Muslim civilization, which in its heyday, particularly the 1100s, 1200s, was not only militarily stronger, but intellectually so, in terms of its culture, its learning, its science. It was the dominant civilization. And most Muslims very much remember this. And so the picture you have is of, in very oversimplified terms, 1,000 years of almost uninterrupted success for the Muslim world. Okay, a simplified map of this. These are the areas of the world at one time or another under Muslim rule. So back to, let's move further on. So you had 1,000 years of success, and for many Muslims, particularly for some Muslim apologists and teachers, this would prove the truth of your faith. I mean, what other religion on the globe has managed to expand, become so powerful, so rich, so quickly? And so everything, if you were a Muslim, everything about you would affirm the truth, the rightness of your faith, and correspondingly, all the defects in everybody else's faith. The truth was winning out. Truth and success were going hand in hand. So this was true for pretty well 1,000 years. And then things began to change. Let me get rid of this map. I'll come back to it in a minute. And then things began to change. I mentioned the pushback in Spain, and then there was various pushback in Europe. And changes happen gradually. It wasn't that Muslims were winning one year and losing the next. They started to lose more battles and more conflicts, and then started to lose more battles than they won, and a slow pushback. So it's a gradual process. But if I wanted to pick one symbolic date as the turning point from the success of the Muslim world to its contemporary failure, it would be September the 11th, 1683. This was when the second siege by the Turks of Vienna. Vienna was laid under siege by the Turks twice. And earlier on, they had not really been defeated, but weren't able to take the place, and then they returned when winter came. In this case, in 1683, they were badly defeated and then pushed back. So pushed back out of Austria, pushed into Hungary, Serbia, Romania, Bulgaria. Then Greece fought for independence from the Ottoman Turks, and then achieved that. So you're getting a pattern in Europe of Muslims being pushed out of areas that they had control. Then the Russians began to defeat on this line, defeating the Tatars here, retaking much of Moscow, and then taking over the area of Ukraine, taking over Crimea, then moving into Central Asia and starting to take over all these particular areas. So pushback in Europe, pushback in Asia from the Russians, and then a pushback right throughout the world as European powers began the process of what we now call colonialism and began to take over much of the world. So along West Africa, Southern Africa, East Africa. The British take over India. They eventually take over Malaysia. The Dutch take over Indonesia. The Spanish take over the Philippines. Portuguese get various territories. The Portuguese established a base here in what is now Yemen, and in fact started an attack on Mecca, which didn't work out. That was in 1506, I think. So what happens now is that this Muslim-ruled area is now being taken over by Christians who had either been confined in political power up here, and but now for some reason have major power and are taking over whole swathes of the globe. They took over most of the globe. And in most cases, the people they took it over from were Muslims. Most of the population, like in India, most of the population is, of course, not Muslim, but at the time of the British coming in, it was the Muslims who were mainly the rulers. So what you're happening is that European powers are now starting to rule over areas which Muslims had ruled for centuries, in some cases over 1,000 years. And if this wasn't bad enough, apart from all the peripheral areas, these European, and for Muslims they would understand them as Christian powers, began to take over the Muslim heartland of the Middle East. The French begin to take over Morocco and Algeria. The British take over Egypt. The French control much of what is Lebanon and Syria. So if we leap ahead to 1925, the Ottoman Empire sided with Germany in the First World War and was one of the losers, so it lost most of its empire. And then it was taken over by others. So in 1625, if you look at the Middle East, there were only 4 areas which were actually ruled by Muslims. These were Turkey, Persia or Iran, Afghanistan, and then the Arabian Peninsula. Now, Turkey at this point was quite secular, a very secular ruler. Ataturk was in power. He abolished the caliphate, the theoretical ruler of the entire Muslim world, a caliphate which had existed 1,400 years. He ended it. So there was no sort of nominal Muslim ruler. He turned the language away from Muslim script and secularized the country. Some similar process began, not as deep, but was in Persia. And Afghanistan was sort of remote and mountainous. But the Muslim world, in terms of rule, has come from this to this. And they don't really rule it. The only sort of significant Muslim ruled Muslim area was in the Arabian Peninsula, which about this time became Saudi Arabia and Yemen. So if you're a Muslim looking at this, You go from those areas one time under Muslim rule, that, to essentially this in a period of 300 years. So from 1,000 or 1,100 years of stunning success to 300 years of failure. By the beginning of the 20th century, over 90% of Muslims were ruled over by European and, for them, Christian and unbelieving rule. So if you go back to the late Osama bin Laden, the chief figure in Al-Qaeda, this was always what he alluded to. It's important to remember he never talked much about Palestinians or other issues, but if I may quote from his first major videotape after the attacks on the United States on September the 11th, 2011, Osama bin Laden said, following World War I, which ended more than 83 years ago, the whole Islamic world fell under the Crusader banner, under the British, French, and Italian governments. They divided the whole world. He was right. I don't think that's a correct analysis. And that's his grievance. He also refers to the abolition of the caliphate. That's a big theme for ISIS as well. If you remember, al-Baghdadi in Iraq, the leader of ISIS, declared himself the new caliph, the ruler of all Muslims. So you have this shrunken, largely defeated Muslim world. And the only real important self-governing area is this. And then at the time of the first Gulf War, Iraq had invaded Kuwait down here, looked like it was threatening to invade Saudi Arabia. So the Saudis invited American troops into this area, an area where non-Muslims were so largely to be excluded. But now Americans, Christians, non-believers are now into the holy heartland of the Islamic world. Quote bin Laden again, this was the latest and greatest aggression. Now infidels walk on the land where Muhammad was born and where the Quran was revealed. If you're a Muslim, or even if you're not, you don't have to be paranoid to see a pattern here. Let's go back to this one. The takeover of these areas by Christians, the takeover of these areas by Christians, the takeover of these areas by Christians, by these areas, then all of this, and the only thing you have left is this. And then in 1991, Christian troops arrive in this area. The walls are slowly, you can't see my hand, I'm pushing, the walls are slowly coming in. The Muslim world is being crushed. So if you want to understand why there is much anger in the Muslim world and much frustration, it's this history. Why have we had 1,000 years of stunning success, followed by 400 years of crushing failure? What is it? And and the question, of course, you would ask is, why? In the title of one of Bernard Lewis's books, what went wrong? What did we do wrong? Well, there's a whole range of answers. One is that this would be the answer given by terrorist groups, but not only them, saying it happened because we ceased to be good Muslims. We no longer obeyed Sharia law. We no longer really followed the Quran and the Hadith. And so we lost. When we were good Muslims, we won. So what we need to do now is get back to original Islamic patterns, restore Islam as it was in the first generations of the Muslim world, of the immediate followers of Muhammad. And if we do that, then we will once again be successful. So this was and is very much the theme of ISIS, which is now more active in the world than it has ever been before, of saying, we want to establish a true Muslim heartland right here, which will be true and holy, and then we will expand and reconquer the Muslim world and take it even further than it was before. Here I'm stressing terrorist responses, but many other Muslims who are not terrorists, who are quite peaceful, would also say that, yeah, the problem is we stopped being good Muslims. We got secularized. We started bringing in foreign and un-Islamic ideas, and this has made us weak, and it has undercut us. So that's one, and so we need to restore a proper Islam. That's one response. And another response to, what went wrong, why this failure, is that because we became rigid, that we stopped learning, we stopped developing, we stopped advancing in the 12th or 13th century, and we just became frozen. We didn't learn militarily, we didn't learn intellectually, and so we were essentially left behind. What we need to do is learn from other people carefully. We don't want to take everything from others because the rest of the world has major problems, but we do need to learn and develop. So this was a very strong theme in Turkey, which secularized, but you would find this in much of North Africa, in Iran and elsewhere. It's a big theme now with a lot of the Indonesian Muslims. I do a lot of work, so that one response in simple terms is we must go back to the 7th century, and the other was no, we must learn to adapt and progress within the true boundaries of Islam. But Islam is the only form of Islam is not the one which existed over 1,000 years ago. So those two responses, and of course there's all sorts of stages within that. So let me just conclude this section at least with just two more maps. Here emphasizing the first response we need to go, which is that we need to go back and have Islam like it was in the 7th century, and therefore we will win again. The radical organization, the Hizb ut-Tahrir, which most of its groups are not violent, but it very much wants to restore the caliphate, to have Muslims united into one territory or empire ruled by a caliph. This is the map as imagined by Hizb ut-Tahrir. And as you'll see, it is basically the same as the red map I showed you earlier. The ultimate limits of Islamic expansion, not quite exact. They should include more of East Africa down here. But that's basically, let's go back to the expansion we had hundreds of years back. This is a map produced by ISIS and about their future Islamic State. Interestingly, they do seem to concentrate mainly on the sort of Middle East, Africa and Southeast Asia, not too much on India and Southeast Asia. But again, this is the land they want back. And the names they use again are names of from 1,000 years ago. So ISIS-K, there is Khorasan, and it's that territory, or and Andalus, or here Habasha, and so forth. So very much wanting to go back to this. So there's their map, and there's the map of areas under Islamic rule. So if we now sort of take a step back and in the light of this comment on why a lot of Christian-Muslim conflict, or a conflict between the historically Christian world and the historically Muslim world, because you've had this history of conflict. Now, let me say, I mean, people weren't fighting all the time. They were, people were trading and swapping things, and spices and silks and goods and coffee and other things were being traded into Europe. Other things were being traded in the opposite direction. It wasn't all fighting. But you had this pattern of conflict whereby in the first 1,000 years, Muslims took over the Christian world, and in the last 400 years, Christians took over the Muslim world. And many Christians don't remember this, but many more Muslims do. And so there is a feeling amongst many Muslims very much of being sort of put upon, squashed, put down by Christians. And this has led to a lot of criticism, a lot of suspicion, and is at the roots of many of the conflicts we see. I mentioned Afghanistan, mentioned conflicts in Iraq, also spilling over into Syria. But as many of you will know, particularly Africans here, one seeing similar conflicts right throughout East Africa, particularly going to Uganda, in Kenya. Of course, we've had that in Sudan. Now even spilling over into the Congo and these areas. And then, of course, West Africa, the Sahel region, and in Nigeria, where most of the deaths caused by Islamist terrorism are occurring. So we have this pattern of conflict. If you trace the borders, this red line, you'll see conflict in almost every part of it. So I'm going to open up for questions, but the main thing I want to emphasize is that if we're covering, antagonism between much of the Muslim world and the West, such as now between France and Algeria, or with Pakistan and others, or if we're looking at outright terrorism, as we see in West, East, and Central Africa, or in Afghanistan, or in Syria and Iraq, then we need to understand it against this particular background. It doesn't just spring out of nothing. It has deep historical roots, and it has deep historical memories. And so if we're to work properly as journalists, we need always, as much as we can, to realize this historic pattern, and not just get caught up simply in the day-to-day events, terrible as they are and difficult as they are to avoid. Anyway, thank you very much, and let's open up for questions.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Paul. This is incredibly helpful, I think, and I'm seeing comments from everybody about that restating that, just this historical context. So please do either ask questions in the chat or, with the microphone here. I'll start off and ask more about some, as you're going through this, Paul, it struck me, or my question was like, what role did both military and other technology play in terms of the initial massive expansion and then the subsequent expansion of the Europeans after that? And, related to that, what's weird now is the world seems to be in a place where we don't believe in colonialism and empire building anymore, except it seems some of the Muslim world still believes in that, those who want the return of the caliphate.
No.
But so it's this weird dynamic where I think the parts of the world that have a lot of technology, both military and other, have the power to, do real damage if we're in a Hobbesian world to others, but are restrained. Meanwhile, except, I guess one wild card could be, for example, China.
Yeah.
And so anyway, just I guess a question about technology, in this historical window you looked at, or windows, and then how does it play out in the future, and how should we as journalists think about and approach those issues of technology?
I think there's a lot of technological reasons behind I'll call it the Christian expansion. For the Muslim expansion, I'm not sure. I mean, how come? I've gone back to the earlier map, the first 100 years. How were they able to take over these areas? Well, one thing is, it's not, you have the Byzantine Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire here. And it had been fighting, it had been weakened, but it was fighting against the Persians here, who had their own empire. I mean, Rome and Persia fought for 1,000 years. So you had these two powers here out of Constantinople, and here out of Persia, Iran, who had been fighting. And this point were pretty well exhausted. So the other empires, when you had the Muslim or the Arab expansion, it was coming into an area where the surrounding empires were pretty well exhausted and not strong. So it was fighting weak enemies. Another fact is that, again, at this point, most of this area had been Christian, but the Christian world, Christian majority world, was itself divided, and that many of the people in this, many of the Christians, well, let's put it this way, many of the Christians in North Africa were regarded by the Byzantines, the Orthodox, capital Orthodox, as heretics. The Egyptian Christians, the Copts, were called monophysites. They had a defective view of Jesus. The Church of the East over here, based in Persia, was called Nestorians. They had a defective view of Jesus also. So many of the Christians in these areas were being persecuted by the Byzantines already. So, they had no love of staying in that empire. So again, the Muslims were expanding into a weakened world, or a world which would be more receptive of them. If you're Egyptian Christian, you're being persecuted by the Byzantines anyway, and who might this new lot be? So I think that was one of the features then. And of course, the morale and the fanaticism of the early Arab Muslims armies was strong, and that carried them a great way. But I think one of the major factors was simply the weakness of the competing powers in that area. If we go back to the takeover by Christians of these areas, for colonial expansion, which I would prefer to call it simply maritime imperialism. It was imperialism like the other imperialisms you mentioned. What was unusual, it was largely done by sea rather than land. And certainly because they lived on the tough Atlantic, the Europeans had developed much more powerful boats and ships than anywhere else in the world. And this gave them tremendous power. Bernard Lewis talks about the arrival of a Western ship, I think it was a British ship, into Istanbul, bearing the British ambassador. And crowds of thousands came out to look at it. They weren't interested in the ambassador, they were interested in the ship, which was a 3-decker with 100 guns. And there was nothing like it around where they were. It could have blasted their entire fleet out of the water. So military technology was a major factor, I think. And another one, I think, was the sort of development of European nation states, where people started to feel some sort of commitment and loyalty to their particular territory, rather than necessarily to their tribe or to their religion. So the level of discipline and commitment of the European power is important. But also technology to do with rifle and cannon and other things certainly helped in that score. But I think the political changes also gave Europeans more power. Sorry, it was a very long answer.
Yeah, this is adding new layers in a good way. So we've got a couple of questions in the chat. Maybe Edith and then David. Edith, do you want to ask your question or would you like me to read it? I'll give you a second here. Okay, Edith says to read it. All right, Edith writes, thank you, Dr. Paul Marshall. The historical background puts things in perspective for me. What I would like to know is whether the continued conflict is motivated purely by the desire for dominance or the belief that certain geographical areas hold a special meaning or value to religions. For example, the conflict around Jerusalem in Israel. Considering the conflict seems more pronounced in certain areas than it is in others, is that so?
Okay, thank you. That's a very good question. Before replying, let me again, I sort of emphasized earlier that while I've been talking about conflict, all these people were not fighting each other all the time. They were trading and learning and doing different things as well. Let me add to that, of course, and people had conflict for other reasons as well. It wasn't all the expense of their religion. You know, people wanted power and fought with each other. Muslims would make alliances with non-Muslims against other Muslims. You know, I mentioned before the Ottoman Empire allies with Germany and Austro-Hungary. So there's all the day-to-day shifting alliances. So you have conflict for political gain, conflict for economic gain, conflict because someone's just a person who wants power. So some additional background. Now, are these conflicts simply about power, and are some because of particular religious significance? I think those two things overlap. People particularly want areas of important religious significance. They certainly want those. So it would be much more important for Muslims to make sure that Mecca is under Muslim control than, say, the southern Philippines in Mindanao is under Muslim control. You'd probably want both, but one has much more religious significance. So that is why for Bin Laden or ISIS, the fact that infidel soldiers, American soldiers, had set foot in the sort of holy area of Saudi Arabia, that for him was a great insult. Similarly, Baghdad, Damascus, centers of the Muslim world for centuries. Again, they have strong religious significance. That's especially true for Shia in this area. And then similarly for Jerusalem. So these particular areas have religious significance. So Muslims of all kinds would be sort of more inclined to, well, firstly, to insist that Muslims control these areas, but be more willing to fight to retain them. So you want, but if you want to retain them or regain them, then you need power. So that's what's going on here. If we shift again, and I know we've got Nigerians with us who know more about this than I, but say when you're looking at Al-Qaeda groups, if you're looking at ISIS groups in Nigeria or in this area generally, and the Fulani activities, some of that may have to do with power. Most people like to be in control. They like to be the boss, the number one, to defeat those who they see as enemies. But again, it's also seen as a religious mission. Boko Haram, major terrorist group there, its name means more or less, books are forbidden, books are evil. I mean, they meant Western books, Western education. And their theme is the first one I mentioned. The problem is we've imitated outsiders, we've imitated the non-believers, we need to get back to a pure Islam. So that's their theme. So some places have more religious significance, and that leads to conflict, but the power and the religious element are often very much interwoven.
Thank you. So we've got great questions rolling in here, and I want to try to group them thematically. So I think we should go to Rachel and Sam Daniel Stalin, and then we'll come back to Jacob and David's question. But Rachel, would you like to ask yours and explain it, or would you rather me read it?
It's okay if you can ask Paul. There's a baby sleeping and I don't want to be too loud.
Okay, thank you, Rachel.
I'll try not to be too loud then.
Great. So Rachel writes, this gives very good perspective on the continuous Christian-Muslim conflict. In other words, I think the historical perspective of also offering light to the current moment. She writes, though fear of terrorism, especially in the USA, is real, I did not quite get the American hand in the rapid expansion of Christianity or invasion of the Muslim areas. What do you make of that, Dr. Marshall?
Oh, okay, thank you for that. The United States had almost nothing to do with it. The United States was not getting that powerful until probably 1860, 1870. And the vast majority of the colonial expansion had occurred before then. And again, the US went after the First World War, when the previous Ottoman Empire in the Middle East was divided between European powers. Again, the Americans had almost no role at this point, and indeed, under then President Woodrow Wilson was seeking to be very strongly anti-colonial. American power started coming in largely after the Second World War, when it was the dominant power. So it started wielding a great deal of influence in the Middle East. And so from about 1950 onwards, it was the sort of dominant outside power in relation to Saudi Arabia, a lot of North Africa, Egypt, and Turkey, and so forth. So the actual direct American sort of military involvement here is came from 1990 onwards with troops in Saudi Arabia against Saddam Hussein, and then obviously into the conflict in Iraq and to some degree in Syria. So the animosity to the US is largely over events in the last 40 to 50 years of its power within the Middle East, and then wars, particularly in Iraq and then in Afghanistan. So America is seen, though for most of this history it played no role, because of events in recent decades, it's often portrayed as the by radical groups as the #1 enemy of the Muslim world.
So, Paul, there's another, I think, element in Rachel's question where she says, I think the Muslim world sees the American intervention in Iraq and Afghanistan as Christian, right? Doesn't the Muslim world sort of equate the two? And also as an invasion, but do you accept that or reject that two-part notion? And should we as journalists, how do we think about that if people in the Muslim world are suggesting that that it's synonymous with a Christian incursion?
Okay, yeah, thank you. Thank you for picking up on that, Paul. The Muslim world is tremendously varied. But in much of the Muslim world, people still see, Muslim majority world, people still see the area of their country as Muslim. And so see Western countries as Christian. So that what a country such as the United, and this means for many Muslims, Christianity is to do with homosexuality and alcoholism and things like this. All the trends you see in the West are taken to be Christian trends, and the two are often too closely identified. So that the activities of, going back to the First World War, the activities of Britain and France are seen as Christian, and then the presence of the American led wars in Iraq and Afghanistan are seen as Christian. So America is portrayed as the dominant Christian power who is making war on Muslims. So yeah, thank you.
Okay, I think that brings us to JSAM Daniel Stalin. Are you, Sam, do you want to ask your questions? You've got one or two there.
Yes, Paul. It was a very interesting talk. I loved it. Two questions. One, how much did American control of Afghanistan over the last 2 decades slow down or impact their expansionist mode, the Muslim expansionist mode? Second one is the widespread terrorism slowing down conversion to Islam worldwide. Is there any study on that or any data?
Okay, on the first one, did the sort of American presence and conflict in Afghanistan slow down Muslim expansion? Probably not. Back almost to where we were 20 years ago. And as an aside, actually, Religion Unplugged, which the Media Project, which is a project of the Media Project, which Paul is the chief editor of, has had some pieces on this and wondering why. And one reason is the American powers that be never took Islam seriously. I was reading one official US government report on, why the failure to sort of reconstruct Afghanistan. Okay. the word Islam does not appear in that report. It's
Mhm.
about 70 pages long, except in names. It refers to, the Islamic State comes up, but as a separate subject, no. So again, the Americans, great tendency of American powers not to take religion, not only Islam, but religion in general, seriously as a political force. So I think that left the US in a stalemate, and it means they still misunderstand the Taliban now. So, yeah, I don't think it made much difference. In the Middle East, in Iraq, essentially defeated ISIS there, but as I said, most of ISIS activities and killing is taking place elsewhere in the world, mainly in Africa. In terms of terrorism and conversion, I'm not sure if terrorism sort of aids conversion. There are a few high-profile cases of non-Muslims who convert, join ISIS, and go off to fight. That seems to be almost like here gang warfare. You're a Westerner, you live in Leeds in England, life is boring, you might be unemployed. And you see these ISIS videos, and exciting, come and join us and fight for this. So they do, and often not very pious. I mean, the bits about praying 5 times a day, giving money to charity and so on are often passed over. And so it's like, joining a gang or something of that kind. Who was it? Christopher Caldwell referred to it, says it's like joining Team Islam. Instead of supporting Barcelona or Liverpool, you're not a player, but that's your team you step for. Islam is now your team. You're not very pious, you're not really a practicing Muslim, but you're going to go off and fight for this team. So there's conversions of that kind, but I don't think there are that many. I think a stronger pattern appears to be Muslims turning away from Islam because of terrorism or radicalism in general. There are many reports, in Iran, there are very many Muslims leaving Islam. Many converting to Christianity, a few groups converting to Zoroastrianism, and many just becoming secular. Iran's population is probably the most secular in the Middle East now. And the reason for this is they look at their government saying, well, if this represents Islam, I don't want it. So, there's a large increase in atheism or agnosticism throughout much of the Middle East. So I think probably while there are some conversions of people drawn into Islam by terrorism, I think much stronger effect is that terrorism and violence disgusts many Muslims, and some are turning away from Islam because of it.
Thank you, Dr.
Paul.
Yeah, these are great questions, and I think it leads us to some of our next questions. But I just want to make one sort of interlude comment that American leaders like George Bush II, and then Obama, and maybe others since then, it seems to me they operate with an idea of faith that capitalism will change China to become more democratic, or that creating some kind of the interventions in the Middle East would create democracy the way interventions did in the former Soviet Union. Is that one way to, and is that correct, Paul? And is that misguided by American leaders? Is it too?
Yeah, I think the description is correct. The sort of for those of you to whom this would mean anything, I said I think they're Hegelians. You know, history has a direction, a progress, and they believe it's a progress towards freedom. So there is this sort of, to use a Christian term, eschatology, that the world will move towards freedom and start to look more like the United States or Europe or things of this kind. And there's a powerful push in that direction. And some might even think it's inevitable. And so there's great worry now as the world is becoming, you know, over the last 20 years, much less free by the measures used by Freedom House. So I think this background assumption that people want to be, to put it too simply, people want to become like us, and that's misled them. A second feature, as you mentioned, that the idea that capitalism or developed economy would change China. And again, this was driven by the idea that there are two basic models, a communist one and a capitalist one. If they become capitalist, they'll become free and open. But that forgets another model, which was fascism or Nazism. You know, Nazi Germany, you know, was probably the most developed economy in the world. The state directed it, but was thoroughly capitalist and thoroughly totalitarian. So you can have economic growth, a strong middle class, all of these things, which people say will bring democracy. Well, Germany had all of those, and it had Hitler. So there is this sort of, firstly, the sort of idea that this inevitable move to freedom. Secondly, that economic development will inevitably lead to democracy. I think both of these are wrong. There's some element of truth, it puts pressure. But the idea that any of these things could at all be automatic is very misleading and has misled them. And not only in understanding much of the Muslim world, but also China. And I think it thoroughly underestimates the power of history and of culture and of religion in shaping people. That's, you know, one of the major reasons for me wanting to give this type of presentation today. We have to take the differences in the world very seriously. So.
Yeah, thank you. And you know, as we then pivot away from the layers of political explanations and historical, I think Dave, let's go back to David's question. And before, David, do you want to ask your question? I think it tees up an interesting, you know, new element here, which is, you know, at the Media Project, we welcome members and attendees from many faiths or those who do not have faith. Although we know a lot of our members come from the Christian world, all parts of Christendom. And so David's asking an interesting question here. David, do you want to ask it, or would you like me to ask it? All right, I'm going to go ahead and read it. It says, what is the Christian strategy to addressing the Christian-Muslim conflict? What should we do now? And I guess you could answer both Christian believing people and or maybe a second answer for people who are Christians and journalists who may be covering this conflict in different ways or places.
Talking about and you know, what should Christians do? Christians generally. The one thing we need to do is firstly be aware of this history and this pattern, and how do we break out of it again? You know, could we be in a situation where the sort of Muslim majority world again begins a stronger expansion or a pushback against the historically Christian majority world, I'm not sure. But to be aware of this pattern and very much to break out of it. If I give an example, that I have another slideshow which carries on from this one, talking about work in Indonesia. Because I'm very interested in Indonesian Islam, which in its dominant forms is much more open and its leaders strongly insist that many things are different in the world right now. We can't go back to the 7th century or the 11th or 12th century. Many of those things are outdated, very outspoken on this. And we had a meeting in Washington this July, which I helped arrange, which was a meeting between the Indonesian organization Nahdlatul Ulama, which is the world's largest Muslim organization of some 90 million members, with the World Evangelical Alliance, which pulls together evangelicals from about 160 countries around the world. These two groups now have a joint working group on to combat extremism, Islamist and also secular, and want to emphasize shared values or shared moralities, which can bridge the gaps between them. I wrote another plug for Religion Unplugged. I wrote an article on this in Religion Unplugged. So we need to be continually, where we can, reach out and try and bridge these be aware of the history and try and bridge these particular gaps. I don't think that's going to help with ISIS or Al-Shabaab or other groups. But for many other Muslims, including ones who may still feel antagonistic to Christians, I think that ongoing outreach is very, very important. And then for Christian journalists, again, to be aware of the differences in which, different ways in which people understand the world and what's going on. People have very different memories. And if two people go into a meeting with radically different views of what happened at all the previous meetings, you can often talk at cross purposes. It's very hard to find, understand what the other person is on about. So I'll stop there. Mm-hmm. So all journalists need training in understanding religion.
Great. I think we'll maybe have some follow-ups on some of these points. Let's go back to Jacob's question. Jacob, do you want to ask your question, or would you like me to read it? Give you a second or two here. Okay. He writes, Christianity and Islam do not agree on the basis of faith. What is your opinion on those who see intermarriage between the two religions as a good idea to promote peaceful coexistence?
Never heard that one before. I would think it's a bad idea. As a Christian, I think it's important that one be married to someone who shares your faith, so that you can work together, you can raise children, you can set the goals of your marriage and family and otherwise. And most Muslims I know would feel the same. People do intermarry, and I know people who've done that. But I'm not sure it's a good way to encourage interfaith. It may encourage interfaith understanding between those two people and others, but as a general policy, I wouldn't recommend it.
Okay. Dorothy, I see you have a question. Do you want to ask yours?
Could you read it out, Paul? Because I'm using my phone, so I don't want to be switching screens.
Sure, sure. Dorothy's writes, if knowledge and technology played such an important role in European colonialism, why are groups like the Taliban and IS enforcing a version of Islam that is so at odds with the modern world? For example, in the area of education for women, especially seeing that the Islamic Golden Age was a period of great cultural, economic, and scientific advances.
Okay, I think because the for a group like ISIS, they probably wouldn't accept that technological and other means were an important factor, certainly not the only factor in the European ability to take over much of the world. They probably wouldn't agree with that part of the analysis, and they're just very much that they would see things very much in fairly narrow religious terms and say, when we are good, faithful Muslims, we win. When we're not, we lose. And when we're not is when we try and imitate the infidel and take over their particular ways. Now, they will take over particular things, and one could point out the contradiction here that they're not using scimitars and they're not riding on horses, which they were in the 7th century. They're quite willing to use modern rifles, mortars, artillery. The Taliban now have $60 billion worth of American military equipment. They will be very happy to use that technology. But the sort of religious analysis tends to override everything else. And just very much the view that if we are faithful, God will make us succeed. And this was why ISIS seeks to set up a caliphate in northern Baghdad against everybody else. They believe that if they established the caliphate, appointed al-Baghdadi a caliph, Muslims from all over the world would come and join, and they would expand and retake the Muslim world in a matter of decades. So the secondary factors, technology, maritime power, things of that kind are for them not really a very important factor. And they would point to things like, for example, saying, well, the Afghans managed to drive the Russians out. Taliban managed to drive the Americans out. So, technology is not all it's cracked up to be.
Right. And just, to follow that, sometimes, I mean, well, how would you answer someone who says that? I mean, if you're asked, well, it looks like the Americans had all this technology but couldn't stay in Afghanistan. How would you answer that? And then a second related to what you just said, if someone says to you, Paul, well, ISIS isn't really Islam, that's just a false vision or a false idea. They're not Islam. How would you answer those two questions?
Okay, for the American stuff, there's lots of things technology and military power can't do. One sees that in Afghanistan. I mean, unless you're going to be totally brutal. I mean, Japan changed in the Second World War, so did Germany after the Second World War, because they were utterly smashed. Japan had nuclear weapons dropped on it. Germany was leveled. So, unless you want to wage war on that level and basically almost wipe out almost everything which had gone before, things are not going to change easily because of technological and other power. And what was the second one? Sorry.
Oh, well, to people who I've been asked several times, or said, when we're
Oh.
discussing ISIS, some people have said that's not really Islam, that they're not really Muslims.
Mhm.
And maybe some of people on this call have heard that kind of question or thought as well in the discussions.
Oh, yeah, but no, I mean, that is very often said by people. It's wrong. They're incorrect. There's a few levels. This is they're certainly not typical Muslims. They're not mainstream Muslims. They don't represent the total Muslim world. I mean, I mentioned Nahdlatul Ulama, who I work with. That's got 90 million people. That's a lot more people than ISIS has. So they're not typical of that, but they are a branch of Islam. They are an interpretation of Islam. And I've written a few articles on this point, going back to Indonesia. The General Secretary of Nahdlatul Ulama, Akiyaya, has been very outspoken on this particular score. He says, it is simply wrong to try and pretend that ISIS or Al-Qaeda have nothing to do with Islam. They have everything to do with Islam. They are a particular radical offshoot of the Saudi Wahhabi interpretation of Islam, and similar parallel developments in Pakistan and India. And they are a sort of reactionary form of Islam. And he will denounce them in all those sorts of terms. He says, but that's where their roots are. They're not secularists, they're not Marxists, they're not Buddhists. They are operating on a particular interpretation of Islam, and they're willing to die, to kill themselves for that interpretation. So distinguish two answers to the question. One is, no, they're not, the real Muslims, they're not the best Muslims, but they are a strand of Islam, and you can't understand them without that. I mean, they're always quoting the Hadith, they're always quoting the Quran, and insisting on a variety of things, and giving attempted religious justification for almost everything they do.
Yeah, I'll drop an article in the chat that I found very helpful on that point from the Atlantic by Graham Wood several years ago when ISIS was becoming a thing, and I think it was titled "What ISIS Wants."
Yeah,
and he basically makes the case that you made here, which is that ISIS sees themselves as more religious than other Muslims.
Yeah.
Okay. Several other questions here. Let's go to back to Sam. Sam, do you want to ask yours since you have your video chat?
Okay, thank you, Paul. Dr. Paul, I'm just curious. India is known to have the largest Islamic population in a non-Islamic country.
Yeah.
I'm curious to know what's the global Islamic view of Islam in India.
Thank you. Let me again say that there's no such thing as the global Islamic view. The Muslim world is very different. Saudi Arabia is very different from Senegal or Indonesia or anywhere. So that would be very different views. I know, correct me if I'm wrong, there have been very, there's conflict in Kashmir, but there have been very few, what can I call them, global type terrorists coming from the Indian Muslim population. I think that's correct. When there was that terrorist attack on Mumbai years back, all those terrorists had to be imported from Pakistan. There were they couldn't get any Indians to do that. Now with Kashmir and sort of particular local conflicts, you will, but this sort of global Islamic thing is not present in India. And I do know there is a ongoing working group and discussions between high-level Indonesian Muslims and Indonesian Muslims and Indian Muslims, because they see themselves as just having very similar views of being. I don't like the word, but I'll just say very moderate in their views or open in that. So I would say for those Muslims who are moderate and aware of Islam in India, they tend to like it. And of course, India and Indonesia are the two world's largest Muslim population countries. So,
Thank you.
yeah.
So I think, with the next, we have about 23 minutes left here. And I think I sense some of the questions, and we're interested in hope, I think, of what, how do we create hope? How do we cover this in a way that's hopeful? How do we, as humans, approach these topics in a way that's hopeful? And so there's some good questions coming up. But Paul, Marshall, did you have slides you wanted to show about Indonesia?
I closed down the slideshow, so let me see if I'll probably cut you off now.
Well, maybe I'll ask a question while, if you can multitask and find those slides.
Yeah, well, let's go on. This is
so
my interest in Indonesia. I say the background was, excuse me, a lot of cough here. Talking about this history of major patterns of conflict. How do we get out of that? And then the sort of increased radicalization in the Muslim majority world. How do we combat? Well, the most important people to do that are Muslims. And though many Muslims are passive in dealing with radicalism, that's because, of course, they could get killed. But amongst Indonesians, you get people who are, in the right sense, aggressive in defending their form of Islam and criticizing others. I'm not sure all of what's in my slides here, but let's try them. That's one of my favorite ones, with people who worry about Muslim women wearing the hijab, the head covering. I was just walking around Surabaya at a Chinese Muslim mosque there, which looks like a Chinese temple, and this lady was there. So I just asked her, could I take your photographs? Her particular hijab is, as you can see, an American flag. That's not something you would see in many other parts of the world. Or that's me speaking at Islamic University there. Some of the cultural background in Indonesia, I'll do this very quickly. This says something about the particular culture here. This was a sign in a store, big tourist store in Yogyakarta. And it would be quite Indonesian to avoid saying smoking is bad or that you shouldn't smoke. So here you express this in a nice, mild way. Smoking is good, but not smoking is better. That would be very Indonesian. Not you're bad, but well, it's good. But this is a better way. And by the way, in terms of for Christians, speaking to Muslims and evangelism, it is you would never want to criticize Islam, but and probably maybe not even say Christianity is better, but you can uphold Christianity as good, as very good, and worth emulating. Culturally, that's quite easy, and I'll stop there. That is, someone decided to build a mosque on the model of St. Basil's Cathedral in Moscow. And those are just sort of a couple of slides illustrating major aspects of the culture in the world's largest Muslim country. So as journalists, I think it's important to pick up on stories such as this. We don't need to sort of deny the existence of terrorism. We don't need to say things like, ISIS are not Muslims. But it is important always to point out many other features of Islam. And if I can, I'll pull with the media project, so let me keep plugging Religion Unplugged. I have a series, probably about 10 articles right now in Religion Unplugged. Again, dealing with Indonesia, but particular features of Indonesian Islam, and Christians and Muslims get together to build a church and to build a mosque or work on these things. I think these stories are important, and so we don't get into it. Firstly, they're important for us to understand about the Muslim majority world, but they are important for readers, listeners, and viewers to understand. So as much as possible, try to cover as many sides of the situation as you can. Not sugarcoating things, but not blackening them either.
Yeah, I asked Melissa if we can find some of those links to drop into a few of those pieces that might be helpful. I see two questions more that I want to make sure we get to, and they asked me to read them. Paul from India is writing, what motivates people to convert to Islam when, I think he's pointing to, when there's difficult PR around violence, not progressive in terms of education or other things we've talked about, and is, in his view, unpopular, perhaps in the Islamic world. I mean, is that, I guess, is that where you see it? And I guess this question, what motivates people to convert in the state of conversions?
First thing is, this isn't a subject I know much about. Secondly, I would be fairly confident that there are a lot of different reasons. There's a lot of particular personal elements. I don't know why. Am I correct in trying to remember? Didn't Tony Blair's wife convert to Islam, or was his sister, or whatever? Julie might know the answer to that. But anyway, what would be her reasons? But let me hazard a guess. Most of the West, at least I'm talking about the Western world now, most of the Western world is spiritually vacuous and getting more so. So, and people are finding Christianity relatively sort of comparatively weak, where Islam is robust. So if you think the West is immoral, with high divorce rates, sexual immorality, drunkenness, drugs, lying, and other things like that, and you're looking for something more disciplined and structured, and then Islam can provide a response to that. So I think with many people, especially younger people, I think that could be a factor. It provides a structure and a moral structure, and it provides discipline, things which are sorely lacking in the West. So.
Okay, that's, feel free to follow up if, Paul, Kingsley, or others, if you have, want more elucidation on any of these kinds of questions. I see another question. Oh, I see, by the way, Melissa has placed a few of these stories in the chat that Paul Marshall wrote for Religion Unplugged. Let's go to a question from Daniel, who I'm not sure I fully understand this one, but he writes, the strong economy would have a power to influence. What would the role of Christians be in such case in presenting the gospel?
I run that by me again, if you will.
The question is, it's worded as the strong economy would have a power to influence, I think, question mark, what would the role of Christians be in such case in presenting the gospel?
Not quite sure I'd answer the question. There is the idea around that strong economies or sort of development, to use a common term, tends to lead to the weakening of religion and an increase of secularism. But that doesn't seem to be the case. What it seems to do is change religion and make it more personal and individualistic. So, and that changes Christian strategies. But I think you'd have to talk to someone who's more skilled in missions than I am for a full answer to that.
Okay, we could bring that one up to Phil Jenkins tomorrow too, perhaps, a colleague of Dr. Marshall's from Baylor.
Yeah.
So thinking a bit more about the question that Paul had just asked about conversion, and also on this realm of solutions or hope, and one thing we've noticed at times on Twitter and Reddit, Religion Unplugged, sometimes we'll do a sprint. So we call it a sprint session, where we'll take a look at, make sure that we're following, a certain religion sort of leading influencers on Twitter or other platforms. And so we've looked at, Judaism one day, or Pentecostalism, or different parts of Christendom and other faiths. We've noticed, or I've noticed, that on Twitter, some of the largest influencers who are Muslim in the US or North America seem to be influencers around ex-Muslims, or it seems to be that a lot of Muslims in our country, at least those vocal on social media, are vocal about atheism or turning away from Islam to no religion. And I'm just kind of curious, and I'm actually going to write a note to one of our contributors to look up the data to see if that's just a perception that I have, or if there's data backing that up. But I think this relates to Paul's question around, are many people in the Muslim world, when we hear, a billion Muslims in the world, how many are devout in their faith versus how many are just living in a Muslim context or country that assumes everybody has belief in the Muslim faith?
I would say, obviously not every Muslim is a committed Muslim and fervent Muslim. I would say, though, that within the Muslim majority world, more of the Muslims are believing Muslims and practicing Muslims than you would get in, not sure what to call it, I'll say in the Christian majority world, or at least in the West. So, in the United States, of the majority of the population is nominally Christian, but many are not practicing. That was just they're born in. With Muslims, there's a tendency to be believing, a greater tendency to be believing Muslims. I think the the percentage of, what can I call it, nominal Muslims who are not committed believers is probably increasing. There's certainly evidence of that from much of the Middle East, but in other parts of the Muslim majority world, they're increasing. I would say likely in the West that you have a higher proportion of nominal Muslims. One reason is they're allowed to be so publicly in some parts of the world, like Saudi Arabia or Pakistan or Afghanistan or Iran, that could get you killed, or if not killed, imprisoned. That'd be true in Egypt and many other places as well. So if people are simply nominal in their faith, you keep it hidden. Whereas in much of the West, there's still threats, but it's you can be much more publicly an ex-Muslim or just a nominal Muslim you don't practice. It surprised me, what you said about one of the most visible ones being ex-Muslims. I'd be interested to see the data on that. One other fact in much of the Western world is that Muslims who've immigrated there from the Muslim majority world often wanted to leave it because they didn't like it. So the fact of immigration from quite a few might already be a step away from Islam. This is particularly true from Iranians, many who've came, to avoid the Ayatollah Khomeini. So that'll be interesting to see what the results are.
Elastus writes a question that says, what is the current relationship between the Nation of Islam, mainline Islam, and the radical groups such as IS? And I'll just note, here in the US, we have public television, PBS, and there's a documentarian named Ken Burns that's, I'd say, pretty famous and is in the genre of documentary filmmaking, and he's done multi-part series on the Civil War or baseball, jazz and stuff, and he did a recent one on Muhammad Ali, the boxer, and it was fascinating to see the religion elements and to hear some of the more of the story there of the Nation of Islam and the role of this boxer Muhammad Ali going from Cassius Clay to Muhammad Ali, and being influenced by the Nation of Islam. I'll put the review to that here as well. So, but anyways, back to Elastus' question again, he's asking, what's the current relationship between the Nation of Islam, the mainline Islam, and the radical groups such as IS?
Okay, I don't think the Nation of Islam, I'm talking about Louis Farrakhan's group now, would have any relation with, contacts with ISIS. Very different. In terms of mainstream Islam and ISIS, we addressed this a little before. The majority of Muslims in the world don't like ISIS. They think they're horrible, and they give Islam a bad name. There would be a minority which, while not, wanting to join ISIS or be terrorists, would have sympathy for them, but generally they're not a sort of majority type group. Now to the question of the relation of the Nation of Islam to mainstream Islam. The most mainstream Muslim groups regard the Nation of Islam as just, it's just this weird heretical movement which has all sorts of beliefs which have no foundation in Islam at all, and don't want anything really to do with it. Now things can change. There were the Nation of Islam movement, a it underwent a big split about 40 years ago. And Farrakhan's group, by far the best known, was the minority. The other group gradually became more Orthodox Muslims, and that's what they are now. I was at a ceremony in a place called the Nation's Mosque in Washington, D.C. They call it the National Mosque because it was the first mosque actually built by American Muslims with their own money. And that used to be connected with the Nation of Islam. Indeed, Malcolm X gave some money for the construction of the present building. But they gradually moved away from that. They abolished their sort of militia type group, the Fruit of Islam. And then they started welcoming white people to join the mosque. Beforehand, it had been, no white people allowed in the mosque. But they said, if we're Muslims, anybody who's a Muslim should be welcome. So they moved away from that, and they started the first chaplaincy for the in the U.S. military for Muslims. So many people, the majority of people and movements which used to be in the Nation of Islam have moved gradually to be part of sort of mainstream Orthodox Islam. The Farrakhan group is the one which remains on the edge. And upon his death, I'm not sure what they will do. It seems to be mainly held together by him. So.
Yeah, I watched the entire Ali series, and I was struck that, I mean, both Ali at that time in his life, when he converted to Nation of Islam, and the leader, they were they said things that were sort of, one could say, was racist and pro-segregation even, that white and black people should be separate. And Muhammad
that's
Ali,
very much Nation of Islam stuff. I mean, the origin things were, white people were a separate creation by an evil scientist.
right.
So, the races are very much distinct. That's why for mainstream Muslims, that's just, that would be like, I don't know.
But as you said, the series also showed, just to, the latter episode showed that Ali himself, I think, became a more devout Muslim, different from Nation of Islam, more Sunni, and I think became a more accepting person in friendship of others. Less, he didn't say what one would say would be racist things in the latter part of his life. So looks like we got one more question arriving, and probably just time, 1 minute left for that question. Elastis is asking, in the last 15 to 20 years, radical groups have established cells in Africa. For example, not too long ago, one such group in South Africa hosted the bombers in Kenya. Besides Boko Haram or Al-Shabaab, what can you say about Africa being a target, a hiding place, or being caught up in this conflict? Very good question.
Okay, Africa, in terms of death and land taken, Africa is the center of this conflict. There's people, I'm sure there's people here from in this meeting from Uganda and from Kenya and from Nigeria and other places who would certainly know this conflict. But you're getting that conflict in Somalia going over into Kenya, Uganda, right through West Africa, the Bight of Africa. In Mozambique, you have ISIS groups operating down in Mozambique, killing very many people, and other places almost too numerous to mention. Reading recently of probably ISIS activities, but certainly Islamist terrorist groupings in Congo. So, all the way through that, they see that as territory they can conquer. They're armed, they have a particular focus. They're attacking mainly civilians, and the militaries are not doing much to combat them. And Western powers are not very interested. So that's extremely worrying situation. So,
Mm.
and as I
Well,
said, there's people on this Zoom meeting who would know more about particular cases than I do.
yeah, yeah, and maybe that's a good one to think about following up next year, perhaps. And I'll turn it back over to Melissa to close us out in just a moment. I know we started at 5 to 10 minutes later, so I guess we're ending slightly later as well. But I think this has been really, really helpful, as everyone has suggested in the chat. Thank you, Dr. Marshall, for spending all this time with us, answering questions, walking us through this history. It's incredibly valuable, and we greatly appreciate it. And this is not the end of our program this week. Let me turn it back to Melissa to give us an announcement of what comes next.
Yeah, well, this was wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Marshall. It's always such a blessing to have you with us. I know so many people really love hearing from you. And I wanted to show this. Let's see, I'm trying to share my screen here and it's a little tricky, but there we go. Yes, so tomorrow we actually have a very good friend of Dr. Marshall's, Dr. Philip Jenkins, who was with us last year. He's going to be speaking about his new book that's recently released. It's titled Climate Catastrophe and Faith. So he's going to discuss how climate disasters are a factor in driving religious change. And we'll have our time of Q&A with that, as well as just as we did today. That's going to be emceed by Religion Unplugged's managing editor, Megan Clark. So Megan's a great person for you guys to get to know. Many of you already know her, but she's wonderful to talk to about if you are interested in contributing to the Religion Unplugged website. Megan's one of the ones that you pitch stories to, and she's just fabulous. So I know she's going to be excited to be with you tomorrow. Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Marshall.
Okay, thank you. Goodbye. Thank you, everybody, for coming.